Next, we will be moving on to AI's impact on the changing UK regulatory landscape with Sarah Rose. And I am thrilled to be joined by Sarah Rose. I think, am I seeing her come on video? There she is. Excellent. Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me here today, Claudia.
Very, very happy to have you here. Quick introduction. So I actually had the opportunity to see Sarah Rose on a panel. I think it was just a few weeks ago. Couldn't help but introduce myself to her after the panel because she just has a phenomenal stage presence. So if her public speaking isn't impressive enough, Sarah Rose is a graduate from Cambridge Engineering and has since dedicated her career within financial services. Her roles have given her exposure across corporate finance, financial markets, risk and compliance at institutions such as Deutsche Bank, Nomura, and Westpac. More recently, she was Chief of Compliance over for a CME group company, but found her current home at Singer Capital Markets, where she's Head of Compliance MLRO. So on that note, Sarah, jumping into our first topic of the day, how can organizations marry AI with internal policies to keep abreast of the latest changes in UK regulatory landscape?
So I think artificial intelligence is a really cool area. I think most of the time we always think about AI and people talk about AI within trading functionality. And I remember being on the dealing floor about a decade ago, and when algorithms first came in, we were all pointing at the traders and going, hey, you're going to be actually replaced by a black box. Maybe that didn't happen, and I have a trading floor to the left of me right now through a door. But when I think of AI more and more, particularly in my role here within compliance, I think about how AI could potentially be used to help compliance officers. Instead of it just being a tool which we have to worry about that front office is using to do clever stuff that's running off on its own, making trading judgments on its own, we can also think about how AI could be used for updating ourselves, our policies, and our people on all the different regulatory changes that are happening. Now, there's a lot going on. We've had Brexit. I think everyone's talked about Brexit to the nth degree, so I won't go on about that. But the key word there I think about is divergence. And when you've got kind of organizations spanning the globe, you've got more types of regulators to look over. And then you've got to make sure that those policies and procedures are adequate to serve each of these different regulators. So with divergence, and also each regulator trying to show some muscle power, I guess, to say we're actually regulating better than everyone else, there's more regulation coming out. Some of it is deregulation, which is always good. I don't have to do my RTS 28 anymore. Yes, which I'm very happy with. But there's other bits which also mean that we have to start thinking about changes that could be coming along. Like, for example, with the review of the prospectus regime, there's changes there. So how can we actually use AI to a compliance officer's advantage in order to kind of update our policies and make sure that we are in line for our organization? Well, there's good news and bad news, I think. If you're in an EU organization, the way that I see EU regulators, ESMA regulating, is much more on a kind of a dictatorial, this is what you shall do, this is what you shall not do approach. But the UK regulators take a more kind of spirit and kind of this is the principles of what we expect from you. Now, I think that's a much better way personally of regulating because you can't know every single situation a person's going to be in. However, it also makes it more difficult to codify regulation. And I think when you think about AI, artificial intelligence, you think about how do you actually codify the requirements of a regulator in order to then push it through into FCA handbook updates, but then further on into policy updates. And I know that clause match is great because it looks to keep an FCA handbook in one place and then be able to feed those updates to people's internal policies. But I think that AI at some stage will play a part in helping to kind of push it through in a more meaningful way for each organization. So there's less work for a compliance officer. So I think that there's a lot that AI could do here to kind of help us in reducing the amount of work that we'll need to do in the future and making sure that no gap is sort of left.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of follows what Livia was talking to me about earlier, also in regards to needing the people to be able to manage the technology as well, right? And having people in the right place, not just relying on a tool or a technology to be able to handle all of these analyses for you.
Oh, absolutely. It sounds almost like you're going to the part 3, which is about kind of AI replacing compliance officers.
We'll skip ahead one and we'll jump back.
So on the kind of I guess it's looking at the people's skills, which is another thing that Livia touched on. And what is it that people will need in the future? And yes, you need people who have that ability to understand code, because as AI becomes more ingrained within front office, because what is AI? It's literally an algo on top of an algo, on top of another algo. And so you'll need to have people who have the technical knowledge to understand what it's doing, what's the essence of it, and how does it actually work. And typically compliance officers today, a lot of them have come from the legal profession, which doesn't necessarily instill the skill set that you may need in the future of compliance. So I think you can see more engineers kind of coming through in that. But another kind of key thing is the softer skills part. So whilst you can keep using algo on top of algo to try and find out what's the best way of codifying what the regulation should be and what does it actually mean in practice for your organization, you need to then take the commercial lens. Because at the end of the day, we all work for commercial organizations which have to be profitable. And you can't just keep slapping rule upon rule, because that's not necessarily going to make you money. So you have to take a pragmatic approach to how you actually implement that regulatory change for your organization, which I think is where a key skill which people will need to have. But on top of that, we also talked about breaches in the control environment. And I think that my personal view is that an algo should never, ever replace kind of what you do with a breach when you find it. There are so many kind of like edge cases when I've seen breaches. There are unforeseen circumstances. There's bits of data that you wouldn't have even thought to look at. And I know, and I'm a great believer that people naturally want to be good. And so I think that that's where a good and key compliance officer person function is, looking at breaches and making sure that proportional approaches are being implemented within those kind of compliance detection control algos. Ooh, Claudia, have you frozen or have I frozen?
I think Claudia may have further may have gone frozen, but I'm happy to step in and ask the last question, which is around how do you see AI replacing compliance officers?
That one we have already touched on. So I think the final question, despite it not being in the same order, is more to do with how do we see UK regulations changing in relation to AI? And I had the privilege of speaking to the head of RegTech at the Bank of England about AI, and they have some really, really kind of cool stuff going on in their technology department. When it comes to using avatars to enable people to have a more personable approach, but also for it to be able to scrape lots and lots of data in order to see things such as Twitter trends, which are usually a little bit ahead of the more formal routes, such as looking at RNS updates. So we can already see it when you're looking at like the crypto space and people who, like influencers, and how they are actually becoming a little bit more regulated and being pulled into the sphere to protect customers. I would envisage that UK regulations will have to change to the customer pull. And as more and more customers wish to use AI to help with their investing, I think UK regulators will have to spend time to understand AI alongside the customer want in order to try and actually drive regulation in the right way there, and not just hand it over to the Advertising Standards Agency. So yes, that's my 2 cents.